The Catholic moral perspective of a state's immigration policy has been a matter of discussion for many because, at its face value, it appears that the Catholic position would be that it is morally just for a state to allow anyone in and not deny the entry of or deportation of anyone. To add on, with Pope Francis verbalizing on the correct Catholic position on immigration, as I will get into, but misunderstanding the immigration crisis in America, even more confusion and detriment is added to the question. Cutting to the chase, yes, it is morally just for a nation with the resources, such as the United States of America, to take in refugees. However, a deep examination is required to recognize what a refugee is. The breakdown of this will also make Pope Francis's misunderstanding of the immigration situation in America clearer. A refugee is considered a person fleeing from their country in light of war, economic crisis, natural disaster, or anything of the sorts that would likely lead them to fatality if they were to stay in their country or be forced to go back to their country if another country won't temporarily take them in. There is no beating around the bush here. Rejecting such a person or a group of people who seek temporary refuge is immoral. St. John Paul II expresses this in a letter called Refugees, a Challenge to Solidarity. No person must be sent back to a country where he or she fears discriminatory action or life-threatening situations. In cases where the competent government authorities decide not to accept asylum seekers, arguing that they are not true refugees, these authorities are duty-bound to make sure that these people will be guaranteed a secure and free existence elsewhere. Recent history shows that many people were sent back against their will to a fate that was sometimes tragic. Some were pushed back to the sea. Others were forcibly diverted towards terrains of minefields where they perished, St. John Paul II said. Additionally, in most scenarios, there will be a mutual desire between the country and the refugees for the refugees to be able to return to their home countries. To do this, the country of asylum, as well as the general international community of countries, can assist the country of origin with whatever cataclysm they are under. This process, as St. John Paul II claims in the same letter, is called voluntary repatriation. A particular expression of solidarity towards refugees is the support given for voluntary repatriation, which is the aspiration of the majority of them. There is felt even more strongly the need to establish a system of international control that would ensure refugees the possibility of returning home in total freedom, St. John Paul II declared. So, what is the exception for America? There isn't any. The issue is, and this is where Pope Francis was potentially misinformed, that the majority of foreigners who deem themselves as refugees in America are in essence just migrants. Though they proclaim that they are economic refugees, they are really just economic migrants who can live off what they have in their home countries, but simply want to sugarcoat it to earn more money in America. But don't first world countries have the moral obligation to take in migrants who can live off what they have at home, but simply want to live a better life in a first world country? Well, the response to that inquiry is a complicated one. In paragraph 2241 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, otherwise known as the CCC, it states that if a country is able, they should welcome a foreigner who longs for security and livelihood, under the conditions that the foreigner understands his duties and has appreciation for the heritage of the country that receives them, meaning the foreigner should pursue integration, while obeying its laws and vowing to serve civic burdens. Now, if a country is able to, can mean many things. Though an initial hindrance that would prevent a country from being able to take immigrants would be an economic one, which is a valid reason of hindrance for America, as the immigration crisis has worsened the living conditions of many natives, it can also mean a cultural one, implying that if more immigrants were to be let into a country, the country's culture and foundational makeup would be in peril. The mention of the significance of immigrants integrating into a country's culture is not only mentioned in this one paragraph from the CCC. St. Thomas Aquinas also mentions its importance in his Summa Theologiae. With regard to these, a certain order was observed, for they were not at once admitted to citizenship, just as it was law with some nations that no one was deemed a citizen except after 2 or 3 generations, as the philosopher says. The reason for this was that if foreigners were allowed to meddle with the affairs of a nation as soon as they settled down in its midst, many dangers might occur, since the foreigners, not yet having the common good firmly at heart, might attempt something hurtful to the people. St. Thomas Aquinas proclaimed. It is pivotal to take the end of that last sentence into consideration. If foreigners do not integrate, this harm from the influx of multiculturalism could cause harm to the natives. This chiefly applies to America, with its highest immigrant group, Mexicans. Unlike the Italians, Germans, Irish, and Poles who came to America, Mexicans have easier access to return to/visit their home country, while also having many Mexicans who have a resentment for America based on historical factors. Over a century and a half ago, America and Mexico were in a state of conflict, with America conquering a vast amount of Mexican land in due course. What must be brought into consideration here is that while American students briefly go over this event in the few pages of a chapter in history textbooks, Mexican students are taught about the conflict between these two countries in considerably greater lengths, thus causing the grudge against the gringo for many Mexicans. Undoubtedly, many great Mexican-American patriots have, as John Adams asked for the Europeans to, cast off their skin to never resume it, as they pledge a full allegiance to America, or at least a greater allegiance to America compared to Mexico. However, the same cannot be said about many Mexicans who storm American highways and wave signs that exclaim that no person is illegal on stolen land, clearly showing a resentment for America's historical actions back in the mid-1800s. This is nothing short of a national security threat and could provide the same harm Aquinas speaks about towards the natives if a demographic shift were to occur. But it is not a matter of if a demographic shift were to occur, it is a matter of when, if America does not combat the immigration crisis. With white people of European descent being a minority in America by 2045, while the Hispanic population will rise to a quarter of the country by that same year, a conflict within America from the embrace of multiculturalism could occur. This could especially be taken into account with the population of white people going down further past 2045, while the Hispanic population would rise even more, considering the advantages of Hispanic families who are subsidized by taxpayers to have comfortable living conditions to the point that they could be able to have more kids, a part of an economic burden that will be mentioned shortly. And neglect of the supervision of keeping the foundational makeup group of the country the majority, while also not pressuring immigrants to integrate, has led to the fall of many nations and empires. We can see a practical mirrored situation between America and Mexico compared to the Roman Empire and the Germanic tribes. When Rome let the Germanic people, whose ancestors they pillaged years ago, into the empire, without being concerned with their refusal to worship the Roman gods and integration into Roman culture, they outreproduced the Romans and inevitably conquered Rome. As Winston Churchill says, those who fail from history are doomed to repeat it. The economic burden, being the retroversion of the GDP per capita, that the immigration crisis has brought to America can also not be unaccounted for. As mentioned already, taxpayers subsidize illegal immigrants to have better living conditions, while natives pay these taxes and are worse off. According to a Budget House government report, 59.4% of illegal immigrant households use one or more welfare programs. When you account for more than half of illegal immigrant households having a US-born child who could receive benefits, many states offering Medicaid directly to illegal immigrants, as well as many qualifiable immigrants for welfare due to poor education levels that tend to lead to low income, which is why illegal immigrants cost more than they give in tax revenue, nothing short of a hot mess is being spelled out for the native taxpayers. Natives are also harmed in the labor market due to excessive immigration, coupled with the fact that an increase in the supply of labor would lead to a decrease in demand for labor. Employers also intentionally set wages so low that a native cannot take it to provide for themselves and their families, meaning the immigrant, legal or illegal, who more likely than not already receive welfare, can take the job for a lower wage, increasing the profits of the employer while setting the immigrant off to take the jobs of the natives. Such measures have decreased the average wage of low-skilled labor by 3 to 4%. Therefore, it seems fit to assert that both culturally and economically, America cannot take in migrants at this point of time, and they must also go as far as deporting a large amount of illegal immigrants within the country. Before reading the propositions below, it must be noted that the end goal of the strict immigration referendum would lead to immigrants slowly being able to come in, just in smaller rates to avoid the reoccurrence of the problems we face today, once America is both culturally and economically not at risk if they choose to do so. Of course, criminal illegal immigrants, above all, should be deported, with Pope Francis even backing this in his letter to America back in February. At the same time, one must recognize the right of a nation to defend itself and keep communities safe from those who have committed violent or serious crimes while in the country or prior to arrival, Pope Francis said. But with America being in a crisis with immigration, it must take further measures than just letting go of the criminals. An immigration pause for at least a few years must take place. A border wall with an advanced security system must be made to halt the invasion that America is currently facing. When America can secure its borders, it must deal with what it has here. As mentioned before, legal immigrants can be as much of a burden as illegal immigrants if they refuse to integrate and are benefiting their illegal immigrant family members, if they are anchor babies. Therefore, legal immigration should also be cut with just one straightforward initiative: modifying the Hart-Celler Act. The Hart-Celler Act, signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965, created an immigration system where a citizen or resident could petition for family members to also obtain citizenship/residency, to where which those family members who receive the petition can also petition for other family members if they obtain the citizenship or residency, creating a never-ending cycle that associates the Hart-Celler Act with chain migration. To end the abuse of the system, the Hart-Celler does not even have to be abolished completely, for it would be immoral to do so. It can simply be modified to only allow a citizen/resident to petition for their spouse and children, and cutting off the cycle right there and then. Just this simple modification could cut legal immigration by the billions, lessening the oversaturation of the labor market while still pressuring immigrants to integrate. As for the deportation of illegal immigrants, a moral and more practical way to carry out such measures would be to implement more self-deportation measures rather than going door to door and tearing up families. A commonly referred to self-deportation measure is making it difficult for illegal immigrants to find work in the first place, often referred to as E-Verify. This system is mandated for businesses to block illegal immigrants from being able to work for these businesses. Massive penalties also must be inflicted on employers who attempt to beat around the system to hire illegal immigrants as a means of obtaining cheaper labor. Another thing that can be done is to cut off welfare access to these illegal immigrant families by revoking birthright citizenship for children who have parents who are not legal immigrants, which Donald Trump is currently working on. Removing the eligibility to find a job with better pay, as well as terminating the exploitation of the welfare system through birthright citizenship, would lead to immigrants being forced to go home by their own will, as the reasons they initially came here would not be applicable to them. Of course, the goal from a Catholic moral standpoint is that eventually we should be able to allow a certain number of immigrants per year who want to live a better life to come here as long as they integrate. But with how dire the immigration crisis is in America currently, such a thought cannot be entertained until we end the crisis that is causing a burden to our culture and economic state.